Morning, everyone.
Good
Good
morning,
morning,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
We're learning Mishnah Shabbos, Perek Yudala, chapter 14, Mishnah Beis, Mishnah 2. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamas Rabinowitz, Shalamas Basar Rav Yaakov Eliezer. Learning should be an aliyah for her neshama.
Amen.
Okay. One of the 39 Avos Malachas, one of the 39 primary forms of forbidden work on Shabbos is called ma'abed, which means tanning. To tan a skin on Shabbos, you take the skin and you soak it, whatever you do to work it over and to preserve it. That's called tanning, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Now, there's something else that the sages forbade because it was similar to tanning, and that is pickling vegetables on Shabbos. To put a vegetable in brine to preserve it, the Chachamim said is forbidden because it's similar to tanning. Not only that, we're going to learn right now, the Chachamim even extended their prohibition to making very salty water, because very salty water is used for, that's brine, right? That's used for pickling. So you're not allowed to pickle a vegetable on Shabbos, and you cannot even make a brine of salt, of a lot of salt and water on Shabbos, even if you're not planning on pickling anything in it, because it looks like that's what your plans are. No. So they use, but the point is, it's similar to tanning.
I always thought
The way they explain here is, again, the wording they use is that the same way by tanning it preserves the skin.
Yeah.
So too, when you're pickling a vegetable, you're doing it to preserve it. Just that clearly, when you tan a skin, that's for permanent change, permanent preservation. While when you're talking about the vegetable, you're preserving it to eventually eat it.
Yeah.
So therefore, it is not it's not even considered a tolda, a secondary form of ma'abed, but it's midrabanan, it's a rabbinic decree.
I always thought that it was a tolda of cooking, because isn't it brought down that, like, if for erev tavshilin?
Yeah, but so kavish is kamavushal, but
maybe just for those purposes.
Why not say? Well, the thing is that you'd have to be living here for 24 hours for that.
Yeah.
Here, who says it's going to be that way?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And for the eggs for Pesach?
But again,
When
saying, I mean, typically, if you're going to pickle something, it'll leave it there for a while.
Yeah.
But I mean, it may not be 24 hours there on Shabbos.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be an act of bishul.
Yeah. Well, it would have to be at least 24 hours. No?
To be considered kavish mavushal. But I'm just saying that, I'm just trying to maybe answer your question by saying that maybe that's not the problem here so much because of the fact that, that would have to be very specific about what you are, that would be 24 hours on Shabbos.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move on.
Okay.
Now, Ein Ois in Hilmi b'Shabbos. You cannot make Hilmi. Hilmi means brine. But we're talking about here, you're making a brine. That means there's a lot of salt in this. How much salt? It doesn't say, but it's a lot of salt.
Mm-hmm.
It's the amount of salt that you would typically use for pickling, for preserving. That you cannot make on Shabbos. Forget about using it on Shabbos. You cannot make it on Shabbos because it appears that that's what you're planning on doing. But you can make salt water, and dip your bread in it, or add it to a cooked dish. Because if you're talking about making a little bit of salt water, not brine, right? So it's not being used. The assumption is not being used for pickling anything. And therefore, make your salt water and use it for whatever you want to do. You want to dip your bread in it. You want to add it to food. Okay, that's the Tanakama. So Hilmi, which is a brine, a lot of salt and water, that you can, meaning what would be used for pickling, that you cannot even make on Shabbos. But to make some salt water that's not used for pickling, that you could. Amar Rabbi Yosi said, "V'alayhu Hilmi be'merube bein mu'at." But is it not brine whether there's a lot of salt in it or a little bit of salt in it? So Rabbi Yosi's point is that you're making a distinction between a lot of salt and a little bit of salt.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the Bartanura says it, but there's a little bit more I think that needs to be added, is that people are going to say, well, what's the difference between a lot? What's the difference between the Hilmi and the salt water? Because one's a lot, one's a little. So people are going to say, okay, so if I cook a lot on Shabbos, I can't. That's a problem. But if I cook a little bit on Shabbos, it's not a problem. The problem is people are going to start saying that there's a distinction in what's forbidden to do on Shabbos, whether it's a lot or a little.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe they don't go so far as by cooking, but maybe by other Rabbanans, by other rabbinic decrees, whatever it may be. Now, but what they add here on the bottom from the Chidush Sharan is, and I think it actually fits into the wording of the Mishnah well, and that is that when Rabbi Yossi says, but it's Helmi either way, means to say that sometimes people did pickle vegetables even in a small amount of salt water. Didn't have to be a full-fledged brine to do it, even a small amount. That's not typical. That sometimes it was done. And being that sometimes there was pickling or preserving being done even a small amount of salt water, therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, people are going to start saying, well, if the difference is it a lot or is it a little? But it starts with the point that there is such a thing as preserving even with a little bit of salt water. So if you want to say, yeah, but that's not included in the rabbinic decree because that's not that common. Okay, but then the problem is going to be that people are going to look the same way they're going to look at this, making a brine. Well, is it a very heavy brine or is it a light brine? And they're going to distinguish between that, and they're going to say the same thing regarding other things. It depends if it's a lot or it's a little. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, either way, you cannot make the salt water. The Eluhen Me'amelach Mutarin. These are the salt water. This is the salt water that is permissible. What do? You first put oil into the water, or into the salt. If you add oil to the water or oil to the salt, that really prevents the salt and the water from mixing. And by doing that, it is very clear that you are not planning on pickling anything. You wouldn't pickle, even in a small amount of salt water, you would not pickle it if you added the oil because it really doesn't allow the salt and the water to mix. So when it's clear that you're not making a salt, when it's clear that the salt water is not Hilmi, it's not a brine, then says Rabbi Yossi, it's okay, then you can do it. But the only way that's going to work is if you first add the oil to the water or to the salt first, and then, meaning add the oil to the water, then add the salt, or add the oil to the salt and then add it into the water. But if you're going to go, but you can't put the salt in the water and then add the oil, because once you put the salt in the water, that already is an act of making brine. At that point, that's brine, right? So afterwards, you're adding in the oil. But when you put the two things together, you made brine, and therefore the order, according to Rabbi Yossi, has to be that you're either putting the oil into the water or putting it into the salt. That's the order, according to Rabbi Yossi, to make it permissible. But the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yossi. It follows the Tanna Kama, the first opinion, and therefore we say a lot of salt, meaning to make a brine, that's forbidden to do on Shabbos, but to make some salt water would be permissible. Have a wonderful day.
Regardless. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Hold on,